Talia Drace trudged through the relentless heat of Girian VI's desert, the hum of her hover sled the only sound for miles. The suns, both of them, beat down on the shimmering dunes, turning the air into a blurry, rippling curtain. She muttered a curse and adjusted the visor of her helmet, trying to ignore the sweat pooling at the base of her neck. Even for a seasoned vet who'd worked on half a dozen desert planets, this was brutal. She checked her handheld scanner again, squinting at the readings. The mining drone's distress signal had pointed her toward something massive out here. The coordinates didn't make sense. This stretch of desert was supposed to be uninhabited, nothing but sand and rock for hundreds of kilometers. But drones didn't just make up stories, and the techs back at the colony swore by their data. Something big, alive, and very out of place was waiting for her over the next dune. Talia crested the rise and stopped short. There it was. The creature lay half buried in the sands, its enormous body curled like a frozen wave. Its dull, glimmering scales caught the sunlight in strange, kaleidoscopic patterns, shimmering faintly even as the beast remained motionless. 6 legs, each as thick as a cargo container, sprawled lifelessly in the sand. From a distance, she thought it might be some strange geological formation, but up close, there was no mistaking it. This was a living being barely. Her scanner beeped softly, confirming what she was already beginning to see. Faint traces of bioelectric activity, life signs lingered in the massive form, but they were erratic. Weak. She approached cautiously, pulling a stasis wand from her belt. Just in case. "Hey there, big guy," she murmured. Not that it would understand her, but she'd found that speaking to creatures, especially the really unusual ones, helped keep her calm. "What happened to you?" The closer she got, the more she realized just how alien this thing was. It wasn't just its size. The pattern of its scales shifted faintly, almost imperceptibly. At first, she thought it was a trick of the sunlight, but after kneeling down and placing a hand near the creature's flank, she saw the truth. The scales weren't just glowing, they were rearranging themselves, creating shapes and lines that almost looked like a language. Her breath caught. "You've got to be kidding me. A Velathan harbinger?" The words sounded ridiculous even to her own ears. Velathan harbingers were legendary, mythological, even. She'd read about them in her early vet training, stories passed down from long-haul traders and exploratory crews. Supposedly, these creatures were interstellar wanderers, emissaries from some ancient, hidden civilization. No one had ever proven they existed. And yet, here was one, stranded in the middle of Girian VI's most inhospitable desert. It took Talia a moment to gather her wits. She reached for her medkit, the small, portable one she used for emergency field work. "All right, let's see what's going on with you," she muttered, pulling out a multi-sensor probe. The probe would give her a better read on the creature's vitals, pulse, respiration, if it even breathed the same way other animals did, and neural activity. But even as she activated it, she couldn't stop staring at the shifting scales. As the probe scanned, the patterns intensified, each glowing line appearing sharper, more defined. It reminded her of the bioluminescent messages she'd seen on certain deep-ocean species back on Terra, but far more complex. The pattern pulsed faintly, almost like a heartbeat. She felt a faint tingling in her fingertips, as if the air itself was charged. Then the harbinger opened its eyes. 5 crystalline orbs along its snout shimmered to life, each one glimmering in a spectrum of colors that didn't quite seem real. Talia froze, her heart thudding. The creature didn't move, otherwise its massive body remained paralyzed, but the eyes followed her, unblinking. "It's okay," she said softly. "I'm just here to help." The probe beeped, and she glanced at the results. Neural activity spiked irregularly, almost as if the creature was trying to communicate. The patterns on its scales shifted again, faster now, the lines forming what looked like star constellations. Talia's mind raced. Was it projecting a map? A message? Some kind of distress call? She hesitated, then reached out. Her hand hovered over a cluster of glowing scales near the creature's neck. The light pulsed faster. Swallowing her fear, she pressed gently against them. The effect was immediate. A surge of energy passed through her, not painful, but strange, like a whisper at the edge of her consciousness. For a fleeting moment, she felt something other than the heat and the sand. She felt the creature's pain, a vast sense of disorientation, and something else. A warning. It wasn't clear, more like an impression than words, but it was enough to make her pull back. "What happened to you?" she whispered again, her voice barely audible over the desert winds. The Harbinger's eyes dimmed slightly, and the pattern slowed. Whatever it had tried to tell her, it didn't have the strength to continue. Talia bit her lip, scanning the horizon. She had to figure out how to stabilize it if she could. This wasn't like treating a sick Rondic lion or a graph cat. This was something ancient, something bigger than herself, and it was dying. She glanced at the sled, her medkit, and the dwindling sunlight. The desert night would come soon, and with it, the freezing cold. If she couldn't stabilize the Harbinger and find shelter, neither of them would make it through till dawn. The desert's chill crept in fast after sundown. Talia shivered as the temperature plummeted, the twin suns dipping below the horizon to leave the sands in near total darkness. Jiren VI's nights could kill even the hardiest travelers, but her thoughts were far from herself. Her patient the Harbinger was still paralyzed, its massive body emitting faint pulses of light from those mysterious, shifting patterns on its scales. It was alive, but barely. Talia had done what she could to stabilize it. She'd administered broad-spectrum metabolic boosters, pumped heat into its sluggish circulatory system with thermal stimulators, and infused nutrient-rich electrolytes through a makeshift drip system. But its unique biology defied most of her tools. Its biochemistry didn't quite match anything in the databases, and it seemed to absorb certain frequencies of light in a way she didn't understand. For now, it was a waiting game. Talia secured the hoversled's tarpaulin over both herself and the creature, creating a temporary cocoon against the sharp winds that howled across the dunes. Her hands shook as she poured a packet of heated nutrient broth into a mug, the simple action helping to ground her thoughts. Whatever this creature was, this Valethan Harbinger, it was in her care now, and she intended to keep it alive. As she sipped the broth, her handheld scanner buzzed softly. She glanced down, expecting a routine life sign check. Instead, the display showed a proximity alert. Something was moving out there. Her heart sank. She switched off her portable lantern, plunging the makeshift camp into darkness. The glow of the Harbinger's scales provided the only light, their faint illumination casting shifting shadows against the tarpaulin. Talia adjusted the scanner's settings, switching to thermal imaging. The screen lit up with warm signatures, a cluster of them heading straight toward her location. "What the hell?" she whispered under her breath. She tapped her comm unit, linking it to the colony's network. The connection was weak, but it should have been strong enough for a basic scan. She ran a quick frequency sweep, searching for any local signals. What she found made her stomach tighten. The newcomers weren't just wandering travelers or rescue personnel. The thermal patterns indicated humanoid forms, but their movements were eerily synchronized, and their body heat was unusually stable. It was almost like they were augmented, their systems regulated by artificial enhancements. The scanner also picked up faint electromagnetic signatures, some sort of cloaking tech, perhaps, or unregistered combat gear. Either way, they weren't from her colony, and they definitely weren't here to help. Talia's pulse quickened. Her sled's defenses weren't designed for heavy combat. She'd rigged a basic perimeter grid, mostly intended to deter predators or signal for help. It might hold them off for a few minutes, but if these stalkers were equipped with cutting-edge tech, she'd need a better plan. As the figures drew closer, the Harbinger's scales began to flicker more rapidly. It wasn't just random patterns anymore, it was deliberate. The shapes started forming clusters that seemed almost intentional. She couldn't read them, but the rhythm felt like an urgent warning. The creature's 5 crystalline eyes flared dimly, and a low, resonant hum emanated from its throat, vibrating through the ground and into her bones. "Not now," she hissed at it, her voice tight with fear. "Just hang on. I'll figure this out." She adjusted the sled's controls, activating the defensive grid. A low-energy barrier shimmered into place, crackling faintly as it wrapped around the makeshift shelter. It wasn't a proper shield, more like an advanced electric fence, but it might buy her some time. The stalkers arrived moments later. Talia watched through her scope as they circled the camp, their outlines barely visible in the faint glow from the Harbinger's patterns. They moved like shadows, precise and silent. One stepped closer to the barrier, a device in its hand emitting a soft, pulsing hum. Talia's scanner identified the device as some sort of disruptor likely designed to deactivate shields or scramble electronics. If they took down her defenses, she and the Harbinger were as good as done. As the stalker reached for the barrier, the Harbinger suddenly emitted a sharp, clear tone. The sound wasn't loud, but it cut through the air like a blade. The stalker hesitated. The patterns on the Harbinger's scales flared brighter, shifting into a sequence that made Talia's handheld comm unit crackle with interference. She glanced at the screen, which now displayed a string of distorted symbols. They looked almost like star coordinates, but distorted, fragmented. Before Talia could make sense of it, another stalker stepped forward, its disruptor humming louder. She had to act fast. Her eyes darted to the sled's controls, the med kit, the Harbinger's massive, unmoving form. And then to the canyon cliffs in the distance. If she could just make it there, she might be able to lose them. The natural rock formations would provide cover, and the storm winds were fierce enough to disrupt pursuit. It was a slim chance, but better than waiting to be overrun. "All right, big guy," she muttered, gripping the sled's controls. "Let's see if you can hold on a little longer." She deactivated the barrier and hit the throttle. The sled's engines roared to life, kicking up a plume of sand as it surged forward. The stalkers didn't hesitate. They were on her tail instantly, their cloaking tech flickering in the dim light. Talia leaned into the controls, guiding the sled toward the canyon, her heart pounding in her ears. The Harbinger's patterns flared brighter as if urging her on, its glow cutting through the darkness. As the first disruptor pulse hit the sled, Talia prayed her makeshift shielding would hold just long enough. The canyon walls loomed ahead, and with them, the hope of losing her relentless pursuers. The hoversled's engines whined in protest, their overworked turbines barely pushing through the whipping desert winds. Behind her, the faint, flickering silhouettes of the stalkers grew more distant. They were relentless, but not as fast. Talia tightened her grip on the sled's controls, her eyes fixed on the canyon ahead. The dark maw of the cliffs yawned wide, offering a slim chance to lose her pursuers. The Harbinger still lay limp on the sled, its enormous form shifting only when the terrain forced it to. Yet, even in its paralysis, its scales glowed brighter than before, their shifting patterns pulsating like a steady heartbeat. Talia felt a strange, subconscious pull toward those patterns, as though they were drawing her onward not just to safety, but to something specific. When she finally reached the canyon's mouth, she cut the sled's power and let it glide to a halt behind an outcropping. The sound of the engine died, replaced by the rushing wind and the faint hum of the Harbinger's rhythmic patterns. She crouched low, gripping her scanner, and peeked back toward the desert. No sign of the stalkers yet. Maybe the storm had buried her tracks. Maybe. She exhaled a shaky breath and turned her attention to the creature. The patterns were shifting again, more rapidly now, as if the Harbinger knew they'd reached a significant point. Its crystalline eyes remained closed, but the glowing lines along its body formed shapes she could almost recognize. Star maps, maybe? Coordinates? She wasn't sure, but the faint impression of interconnected lines suggested a destination, a path. Wherever the Harbinger was trying to go, it hadn't been random. Someone or something had intended for it to reach this place. Talia just couldn't figure out why. "All right, big guy," she said softly, brushing a gloved hand over the Harbinger's massive flank. "What do you want me to do? Is this where you needed to be?" The Harbinger's patterns pulsed, then slowed. The scanner in her hand emitted a sharp tone, displaying an energy reading she'd never seen before. She frowned, tapping at the device. The signal was coming from deeper within the canyon, an unusual, localized energy signature buried under layers of rock. It had the hallmarks of artificial construction, though the mineral composition suggested it was ancient. Something was down there. Something that had been dormant for a very, very long time. Talia hesitated. She was a veterinarian, not an archaeologist or engineer. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling that this was the answer the Harbinger had been guiding her toward. She retrieved her toolkit from the sled, checking her energy reserves and handheld probes. If she was going to investigate, she'd need to move quickly. The storm might hide her for now, but the stalkers were still out there, and they clearly wanted the Harbinger. The creature shifted slightly as she moved. It wasn't a full motion. Its massive body still appeared paralyzed, but one of its 6 legs twitched, and its crystalline eyes flickered faintly before closing again. Encouraged by the slight improvement, Talia murmured, "Hang in there. We'll figure this out." She set off into the canyon, following the scanner's guidance. The rocky terrain made it slow going, the wind cutting through the narrow corridors like a blade. She was halfway to the energy source when the scanner's reading spiked. The ground beneath her feet shifted slightly, almost imperceptibly at first, but then more pronounced. The energy source wasn't just below her, it was active. At the edge of the canyon floor, she spotted what looked like a collapsed structure, half-buried spires of dark material jutting out of the sand. As she approached, the glowing patterns on the Harbinger's scales, visible even from the sled's distance, intensified. It was reacting to this place. She knelt and brushed away the sand from the nearest spire. The surface was smooth, almost glass-like, but it emitted a faint warmth. Her scanner confirmed the material wasn't native to Gerion 6, and the energy signature pulsing through it was too complex to be natural. She stepped back, her mind racing. The Harbinger's patterns weren't just random signals. They'd been guiding her to this buried structure. Whatever was beneath the sand was ancient and intentional, built by someone or something with technology far beyond anything she'd encountered. If the Harbinger had been trying to reach this place, there had to be a reason. Before she could dig further, a sound made her freeze. A faint, mechanical hum, growing louder. Her heart jumped. The stalkers had found her. She grabbed the scanner and scrambled back toward the sled, the wind carrying a sharp, piercing note that could only mean one thing: the disruptors were active again. When she reached the sled, she saw them in the distance, shadowy figures cutting through the storm. The Harbinger's scales flared brightly, illuminating the canyon walls. It emitted a low, resonant hum that made Talia's teeth rattle. Whatever it was doing, it seemed to be responding to the stalker's presence. She jumped into the sled and started the engines. "I get it. We're not done here." "Hang tight," she muttered, glancing at the Harbinger. Its crystalline eyes were half open now, their light flickering in time with the glowing patterns on its body. As the sled powered up, Talia made a decision. She wasn't going to let the stalkers get their hands on this creature or whatever secrets lay beneath the sands. If the Harbinger had brought her here, it had to mean something. And whatever that was, she intended to find out before it was too late. Talia veered the sled into a narrow rock channel as the shadowy figures closed in behind her. The Harbinger's scales burned brightly now, their patterns shifting with an almost frantic urgency. Her heart pounded as she pushed the sled's engines to their limits, the wind tearing at her and kicking sand into every crevice of her equipment. The disruptor's whine grew louder, piercing through the storm's roar. If she couldn't shake them soon, they'd catch her before she reached whatever lay buried at the energy source. A sharp turn brought her into a sheltered hollow space walled in by craggy cliffs. The stalkers couldn't follow her straight through, they'd have to go around or risk losing their cloaking fields in the cramped confines. For the moment, she had a little breathing room. Talia killed the sled's engines and jumped out, grabbing her scanner. She wasn't far now. The strange spires she'd seen earlier jetted up at the canyon's far end, forming a jagged silhouette against the storm-dimmed sky. They weren't just natural formations, her scanner confirmed that. The energy source was coming from beneath them. The Harbinger, still motionless on the sled, pulsed faintly, its scales casting long, flickering shadows. Its 5 crystalline eyes were open now, though clouded and unfocused. Just a little longer, she muttered, more to herself than to the creature. We're almost there. She pulled a laser cutter from her toolkit and began clearing away the layers of compacted sand and rock around the nearest spire. The material beneath wasn't stone, it was smooth, metallic, and humming with faint energy. As she worked, she kept glancing back over her shoulder, expecting the stalkers to appear at any moment. But the hollow remained silent, save for the wind and the soft, pulsing hum from the harbinger. Finally, the cutter broke through to an open space. The sand cascaded down into a dark cavern below, revealing a sloping ramp of the same glassy, alien material. Talia peered into the shadowed interior, her scanner flickering wildly. The energy readings down there were off the scale. Something deep within the structure was still active, pulsing with ancient power. She looked back at the sled. The harbinger had gone completely still again, its glow dimmed but steady. The patterns on its scales had frozen in place, forming a complex lattice of lines and symbols that seemed to point directly into the uncovered chamber. It had brought her this far, led her to this place. She wasn't about to turn back now. Talia slid down the ramp, the air growing cooler and thicker as she descended. The cavern walls emitted a faint light, their surfaces alive with slow, deliberate shifts in color. Her scanner beeped continuously, its readings jumping all over the spectrum. This place, whatever it was, had been dormant for who knew how long, but it wasn't inert. Something down here was still waiting. Still watching. The passageway opened into a vast central chamber, its ceiling arching high above her. In the center stood the source of the energy signature, a massive crystalline structure, its surface swirling with faintly glowing patterns not unlike the ones on the harbinger's scales. Talia approached cautiously, her every step echoing in the silent expanse. The crystal pulsed as she drew closer. Her scanner struggled to process the readings, alternating between warning messages and raw data streams that she couldn't make sense of. When she reached the base of the structure, the glow from the harbinger's patterns flared to life again, filling the chamber with a soft, shifting light. The crystalline structure responded, its surface rippling as if it were alive. Talia froze as her comm crackled, the translation software struggling to parse what it was hearing. A distorted voice emerged from the static, a voice that wasn't hers, but not quite alien either. The fracture must be sealed. The code must endure. Talia's pulse quickened. What code? What fracture? What is this place? She whispered, though she doubted the crystal or whoever was speaking through it could understand her questions. The harbinger's scales pulsed brighter, and the chamber itself seemed to resonate with the same rhythm. Talia's scanner translated another fragment. The harbinger carries the memory. The memory is the key. Memory? Key? Talia's head spun. Was this creature not just an emissary, but a living archive of some ancient, lost knowledge? And if so, what had paralyzed it and left it stranded in the desert? She thought back to the stalkers, the disruptor devices, the coordinated pursuit. They hadn't just been after the harbinger's life. They wanted what it carried, whatever was stored in its mind, or encoded in its bioluminescent patterns. Before she could process the implications, a distant noise snapped her out of her thoughts. Footsteps. The stalkers had found the hollow. They were closing in, and there was nowhere else to run. Desperate, Talia placed a hand on the crystalline structure. It was warm to the touch, humming gently. The glow from the harbinger's patterns intensified, and the crystal responded in kind, flaring with brilliant light. For a brief moment, she felt something rush through her, a flood of impressions, too fast to grasp. Star systems she'd never seen. Symbols she didn't understand. A sense of vast, ancient purpose. Ceiling fracture, the distorted voice whispered again, then faded as the light dimmed. The harbinger emitted a final pulse of energy, its glow steady and calm for the first time since she'd found it. When Talia turned back to the chamber's entrance, she saw the stalkers standing frozen in the doorway, their devices flickering and failing. The crystal's energy surged outward, a protective barrier that forced them to retreat. As the figures melted back into the storm, Talia exhaled in relief. The harbinger had gone still again, but not lifeless. Its breathing was steady, its glow serene. Whatever it had come here to do, it seemed to have finished. The cavern was silent once more, but Talia knew she'd stumbled upon something monumental. A story, a code, a piece of the galaxy's past, and the Harbinger had carried it all the way here. For now, all she could do was return to the surface and tell her story. The Harbinger would stay with her, at least until she figured out what to do next. Maybe she'd find someone who could decipher the patterns, uncover the meaning behind the memory it held. Until then, she would protect her patient, her mystery, and keep the secret buried beneath the dunes safe.